Thank you all very much for being here tonight for our second ever EmployME Chats. Our first one was a few months ago. It was on autistic entrepreneurship, and our second one, with community community request and feedback, we are talking about navigating conversations about workplace accommodations. And this event was funded by the Glen and Dorothy Stillwell Charitable Trust. So we want everyone to know that all Autism Tennessee spaces, including our online gatherings, are body-mind friendly spaces. So during this gathering, please feel free to stim, lie down, stand up, fidget, doodle, pet your animals, move your body, step away from the space, have big feelings, plus any other movement or emotion that works for you. And here's some guidance on how you can participate in this gathering. You are welcome to just join and observe the panel discussion. You're not required to use your video camera. You can participate with video, audio, and or via the chat box. When you're not using your voice, please just mute your microphone. And you can input questions and comments throughout the panel discussion in the chat box. You can send them to all attendees, or you can send them to just the moderators. So that would be myself and Lisa Krajewski, if you want your question to be anonymous. And after the panel discussion, we will have time for Q&A. And you can also turn on captions in Zoom. So you can have the ability to turn those on using the controls on your Zoom. So this is our participation agreement. We all come to this gathering being mindful of creating a space that's inclusive, respectful, welcoming, and kind. We keep focused on our topic of discussion. We share our perspectives and are respectful about listening to others. Even when we disagree, we don't judge or invalidate others' experiences. We maintain confidentiality. We own our impact as much as our intent. We're intentional about creating spaces for others. We honor everyone's pronouns and other ways they self-identify. We give the benefit of the doubt and ask questions to clarify. And we remember we all come to this gathering with different experiences and backgrounds. We have a community values document that you can access that Lisa is going to put into the chat. And also, if there's a conflict that arises now or in the future at any Autism Tennessee gathering, you can fill out our Share a Concern form and a staff member will follow up. So, a little bit more about Autism Tennessee. Autism Tennessee envisions an interdependent world where diversity is embraced and autistic people have opportunities to thrive. Our mission is that we bridge the gaps between support, resources, and programs so that autistic people are empowered to recognize their potential and discover the meaningful connections needed to realize their goals. So, what does Autism Tennessee do? We advocate for policies and programs that honor autistic people and their support networks. We celebrate by hosting events that amplify the culture, achievements, and strengths of autistic folks. And we educate by providing resources and diverse learning opportunities for individuals, their families, and the broader community. We have a vibrant community of autistic adults. We actually have a few different self-advocate community groups that are an affiliate of the National Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. So if you are interested in joining any of these groups that are relevant to your experiences, that would be Connect, which is open to all autistic adults, the Spectrum Connection for queer autistic adults, Unveiling Autistic Identity for late discovered or late diagnosed autistic adults, and WinBe Connect for women, non-binary, and gender expansive autistic adults. So if you're interested in joining any of those groups, you can check out the Autism Tennessee calendar and just sign up for an event. And once you're signed up, you're part of a group. And we can put that link in the chat too in a few minutes, unless Lisa's able to grab it. But we can do that in a few minutes. We didn't have it in our doc, and I just thought of it. Sorry about that. Okay. We also do spectrum chats, which are different topics that are relevant to the autistic community. Our next one is on February 18th, and it is called Being Black and Autistic. And that one is, again, on February 18th, and that one you can also find on the calendar. EmployMe is a program that's designed for autistic advocates in their journey towards meaningful employment. We do that program every quarter for autistic job seekers, and we also provide training for employers at the same time. And this is kind of a component of the EmployMe program. And then finally, we do community advocacy that where we're advocating for our community. And one of our next opportunities will be on March 11th at Disability Day on the Hill. So again, this chat tonight is part of our EmployMe program. Thanks to the Glen and Dorothy Stillwell Charitable Trust, we're actually able to pay our panelists to be part of these events, which we feel is very important to be able to compensate people involved in the panel. And then our panel discussants are Marianne Gill, Arden, Tara, and Jeremiah Jones, who will introduce themselves in just a moment. And thank you all to our panelists and to our volunteer, Lisa, for being here. Okay, so I guess we can get started with our first question. Let me pull that up. Well, I guess when you answer this first question, if you would like to just briefly introduce yourself, you can do that. So our first question is, in your experience, how does workplace ableism manifest, and what are some common misconceptions about accommodations that we need to challenge?
Yeah, I would say a big part of what really like consistently needs to be challenged for workplace accommodations is like they exist for a reason, and ultimately they can be beneficial to employers as well. And I think that a lot of the times employers don't really realize that or want to think about that because it's just another thing. And but they can ultimately allow someone to be, do incredible things at their job, but and you can lose creativity and experience, like life experience, from people with unique points of view and lived experience, um, without that kind of thing. But I think a lot of employers, it's not pitched like that to them. I think they tend to view it as this employee is going to be, difficult to employ or work with. And um, so I think that that's from a employer standpoint. I think that's a big issue for folks. And as for how it manifests, the myriad of ways is kind of just everywhere. It manifests pretty much everywhere. So
Thank you. Arden?
Hi, I am Arden. Just to introduce myself, I've worked as a librarian for about 10 years, so I work with the public on a daily basis. Um, and I currently have accommodations, but I think how workplace ableism manifests is right from the interview. People just go off of things that maybe autistic people aren't always great at doing, like having natural charisma and stuff like that, and being really good at social interactions. So, yeah, and then I think also it can just, be a reason that you're excluded socially, maybe by coworkers, or um, your supervisors assume that you're not capable. Um, and I think something that we need to challenge is that people think accommodations are a privilege or like something that's like, um, I don't know, like special treatment. And I just want to say, like, it's a right. Like, we have a right to that legally. I do believe that um, the ADA is only applicable to employers that have at least 15 employees. You can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I think it's still a right, even if it's not like legal, I guess. I feel like we all just have like a human right to ask for what we need.
Thank you, Arden. Marianne?
Hi, my name is Marianne. I have worked for the last few years in special education and healthcare settings, specifically providing developmental and psychosocial support to kids in healthcare settings. I'm sort of a late discovered, late diagnosed autistic person. And so it was just a couple of years ago that I went through the accommodations request process. I think I have an interesting perspective on ableism in the workplace because for me, I spend so much time working with autistic kids or kids with other kinds of disabilities that I take a lot of cues from my coworkers on how they interact with and talk about those kids. And I think that's something that people don't always consider in my field is like, I'm listening to everything that you're saying about these kids that we're working with and like making assumptions or like guesses for my own safety about, you know, what you would think of me if you knew I was autistic or like what's going to happen when I bring that up. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about, I think like Tara said, like ableism is everywhere in the workplace, but it's been really interesting and eye-opening for me to see how healthcare providers and staff and educators sometimes talk about disabled people and autistic people. And that definitely influences my interactions with them. So workplace ableism. And then misconception about accommodations. For me, I feel like when I was going through the process of requesting accommodations, I would tell friends and family about it. And I would say like, yeah, I'm nervous. I haven't heard back from HR yet. And they had this very like simplistic view of like, oh, well, you requested them and like we have the ADA. So like that's illegal if they say no. And I was like, I really wish it were that simple of a process. So yeah, I think there's some misconception from people who haven't been through it that it works like that.
Yes, Tara. And also, if you have your hand raised and you're the only person whose hand is raised, just feel free to go ahead and chime in.
Okay. I mostly realized I totally forgot to introduce myself. So I was gonna just do that real quick. I'm Tara. I have spent quite a while working specifically with folks who have like mental health disorders as largely as a peer. And I've also done like a variety of different social work roles from just kind of connecting people with resources to actually going out and like meeting with people in the community. Um, and I have since moved into like higher ed administration. Um, and I've been a manager of folks who were considering seeking accommodations and also talked to other folks who were under other managers who were actively like looking to get accommodations. And I've also had accommodations myself. So like I've kind of been seeing it from a lot of angles.
Thank you, Tara. And Jeremiah, I saw your hand was raised.
Yeah, I'm Jeremiah Jones, staff attorney with Disability Rights Tennessee. We're the state protection and advocacy agency. So if you have any questions about this type of discrimination or really anything disability related, you can reach out to us. But regarding, I'm just going to even take a step more fundamental as far as like the ableism in employment, that unfortunately we're still at this space where if a disability is not visible, that there's kind of the assumption still, so that it does suck that we're still in a situation where if you're not really forthright or upcoming with your employer about what you need, that there might not even be the recognition that uh, there is something that can be provided that can help out. So we still have a long way to go, and so as far as it being manifested, it's still just, if it's not apparent and obvious, a lot of times employers don't even ask.
Yes, that brings us, well, brings me kind of to my second question is, well, second and third. So the second one is, how can autistic employees determine what accommodations will best support them, particularly if they are unsure what to ask for? And one person asked a specific question related to this. For folks who are dealing with executive dysfunction, what are some accommodations that could be supportive?
I'm just gonna start talking since I'm the only one. So, um, I think there's a really great resource, askjan.org, that will actually give you a list of suggested accommodations for executive function specifically. Um, but I also want to say, like, this is an interactive process with your employer. So it's kind of like a conversation. And if you don't know, they might have ideas. Um, if you have an idea and it doesn't work for them, then they might have an alternative. Um, but I think, like, for me, mine are a couple of mine are like written communication for tasks. Um, like a modified break schedule so that I can take a break if I need to at any time. And then I feel like also just addressing your sensory issues can help with executive function. So anything like lighting or temperature or sound. Yeah, that's all.
So one thing that helped me when I was trying to figure out what accommodations would be helpful for me, I also used AskJan and highly recommend that website. But I thought a lot about the ways that I was already accommodating myself and how I could translate those. So, for example, whenever I'm on a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting for work, I have live captions on because I struggle with auditory processing. And I do a lot better when I can see the words. And I realized I could ask for that to happen. We would often have large department meetings where most of the members of my department were there in person, but we also had some people joining via Teams. So we had a Teams meeting on in the background, and I could ask for the captions to be turned on in that meeting so that way I could read the screen and follow along with whoever was in the room was saying. So it helped me to kind of like work backwards in that way, like think about what I was already doing for myself and how I could get sort of like guarantees that other people would accommodate me in that way as well.
From a just kind of basic point of view of like having supervised folks or just being a supervisor, is that usually supervisory folks are told to just not talk about the ACA, like, or ADA, sorry. Um, and it's just, just don't bring it up. Like if it's posted in the places where it has to be posted, they're like, yeah, don't bring it up. Um, and so there's your supervisor, like, especially if you have a good relationship with your supervisor, there's a pretty good chance they see things that um are, you're struggling with. And if you have a good relationship with them, there's also a pretty good chance that they like are inclined to listen to you, but have been told and are would be risking their livelihood and their ability to make money to survive if they made HR angry by um, saying that, like telling you about them. Um, I've been a little bit more loose-lipped about that than my HR folks would have liked when I've supervised folks, but um, a lot of managers may want to help, but are also scared too because they're beholden to rules that are not fair. So it's something to keep in mind if you're worried about bringing it up. Um, and I also think what Marianne said about what are you already doing kind of for yourself um, is really a good thing to think about, because I know folks who have been doing the thing, but it was time consuming. Like I knew someone who we had to write progress notes and they wrote them all on paper before writing them on tech or on a computer because they couldn't really do it otherwise. That's a lot of duplicated work and a lot of effort. And uh, they asked if they could OCR, optical character recognition, so scan in their notes basically, which was actually declined, and we already had the software to do it on our computers, so I just told them to do that. But um, the yeah, so a lot of the times you're already doing it, and you just need it codified, kind of. And I think also, like, people think that an accommodation is something that you also need to have to work, but the ADA also, um, you can use accommodations to protect things you're already doing and that are being like accepted or tolerated or encouraged from like another person in another department saying, hey, that's not fair. And if you have it like as a legal thing that is protected, it's really just protecting your ability to do what you're already doing. So accommodations are not just about getting new assistance, they're also about protecting you um, from inner workplace drama that may occur based on something that someone is helping you do.
Thank you all for your comments on that. Our next question is, and folks are asking the same question in the chat, how do you go about asking for accommodations? Whether, and you can talk about your experience either doing that during the job search, after being hired, or following a job change, or later diagnosis. Any of those things that relate to your experiences.
I was
Mary,
gonna start talking because I was the only one, but then there were two hands.
how about Marianne, then Arden, and Tara?
Okay. I feel like I got kind of lucky in some ways that I was at a big organization like Vanderbilt when I like realized I was autistic, got a diagnosis, started to explore accommodations because they have a very clearly outlined process for how to request accommodations. And I think that's not always the case at like a much smaller company or like somewhere that's kind of less structured. So I was able to like go to the HR website, find the policies that applied to me, find the right forms to print out and bring to the doctor. And the organization is so large that we have different HR people assigned to different departments. So I kind of knew, like I had a specific HR person assigned to me who like oversaw the case and we were in contact. So that was like, in terms of actually figuring out like, how do I get to the point that I want to be, like that was pretty clear cut. I think there is some nuance to like whether or not you kind of like talk about it or like how much you talk about it, whether you disclose your diagnosis or how many like medical details you're talking about with your supervisor before you start that process. At least for me, it was like I could have like sat down and talked to my supervisors and been like, hey, heads up, I'm going to do this, like here's why. Or I could have just kind of like sent the forms to HR and let HR tell them. So there were a lot of choices to be made on that end.
So I wrote down if you're trying to decide when to, like I think about, do you need accommodations for the interview? Personally, I do think it's safer to disclose after, but sometimes you need those accommodations for the interview. I do think if it's related to the work you're doing, like if it's a disability organization, you can bring it up and it like makes sense, like why you're bringing it up in the interview. I feel like if it's a deal breaker for you that your employer is neuroaffirming, then you should ask about that in the interview. I do feel like it will negatively affect your outcomes because people are ableist, but you know, if that's like something that you need, then find out because like you're finding out if it's the right place for you to work, not just the other way around. And like you can't undisclose, so like be sure that you want to and think about the reasons that you want to disclose. When I did it, I had just come back from FMLA leave, and I had told my supervisor that I was going to do that. And a lot of the things that I was asking for were things that I was already doing, but my manager, you know, a manager could suddenly get sick or change jobs and a new person could come in and that new person isn't gonna have the same like outlook as your old manager who let you do the things. So I do think it's important to get it like official, if they are things that you need. Um, I think that's all I wanted to say.
Um, as to the when to ask for accommodations, like first, I don't think it's probably usually prudent to just go to your manager or HR and say, "Hey, I'm starting this process." I think it is probably good to start that either with, your whoever would be documenting your a, the reasoning for your accommodations. So could be a therapist, could be um, you know, a specialist doctor, whatever. But I also think that like for accommodations, usually if you need them, you should get started in the process asking for them because I think that if they say, or if you are able to get the accommodations versus if you're not able to get the accommodations and your work suffers before you have them, depending on your employer, that might be a thing that they're like, well, we just don't want to deal with this now. And if you can get an accommodation before you like desperately need it and are burning out, um, that can help a lot with just kind of your ability to maintain stability at work. And also just not feel as bad when you're not at work because you're already getting, um, hopefully, some more support at work. So kind of the best time to start is now kind of thing, but not necessarily best to immediately start with your employer. Um, but if you have spoons for it, it's a process. So, um, and also with the disclosing diagnosis, from what I understand, you don't actually have to explicitly say what you're diagnosed with at any point. The Your provider is the one who basically will give the justification in a written statement, and they can say basically why you need these things, but they don't necessarily have to say you're autistic or you have bipolar disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or anything like that. Um, and I think that providers can sometimes be, especially therapists who like specialize in that kind of stuff for mental health, which is what my accommodations have been for, um, are know how to write those things and often will be able to ask you the questions that they need to be able to advocate for these for you. So you're not really just alone in wondering about what you need, especially if you've been seeing a provider for a while. Um, they probably already have ideas of things that are frequently asked for in your situation because the odds are you're not the first person who's been dealing with the thing that you need help with.
Thank y'all for answering that question. Jeremiah, was there anything that you wanted to add at this point, based on some of the commentary?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it would be good to just kind of it's certainly a case by case basis. But I think the important thing is that you do have to provide your employer with enough information so that way they can provide you with an accommodation that will address the specific work barrier that you are experiencing because of that disability. Like you don't have to have like if you have a provider, they can kind of state what how this impacts you. They don't have to say the exact diagnosis. That's correct. But you do need to give the employer enough information so that way they can and they can ask for documentation because if you don't have a recognized disability, then reasonable accommodation does not actually enter into the picture. It has to be one that's recognized by the ADA, and it's completely okay for an employer to ask for documentation. They can't ask for your complete medical history and all those things, but as far as a basic rundown of what is this, is it a disability, and how does it impact you? Um, but as far as like when to do it and those sorts of things, um, I think it's really more about feeling out how your bosses, how your supervisor are. Is it a big company? Is it, and I don't think there's any like one answer to that. But just being mindful that I know there was a question too about who do you ask if there is not an HR person. Basically, anyone who is a supervisor, manager, it doesn't need to be in writing. You can just, it doesn't have to be in fancy legalese at all either. You might want to request it in writing just so you have a paper trail that you brought this to someone's attention in a certain time period. It's not necessary. But it's really more about, it seems with the folks that come to us and need assistance with this, if you can have a good conversation with your employer and being honest and back and forth to figure out what does work, what does not, um, those seem to have the best results. If you're sorry, I can't be of more help, but
Thank you. That was helpful. And we are getting some questions in the chat, and we're going to start reading those out loud around 7:45, if that's okay, everyone. Um, our next question is one person asked, also related to, the process of asking for accommodations. Is it helpful? Okay, sorry. We'll put it in the chat too, if for the panelists to read it. Is it a helpful or unhelpful move to show vulnerability in this type of conversation? For instance, is it good to share that bringing up the topic is difficult and it's scary to put yourself out there? Or is it best to remain totally cool and unmoved like you're asking for office supplies?
I think it literally depends. Um, is the person that you're talking to, have you noticed that they respond to vulnerability, or are they more like serious and like black and white kind of, um, I guess like you don't have to share anything that you don't want to, so you don't have to be vulnerable. That is like completely a personal choice and just kind of like I think you should just feel it out. Like, um, I know it can be hard to tell like how someone's going to react, but um, yeah, I just think it depends.
Oh, were you done, Arden? Um, I think that that's probably the biggest thing as well, what Arden just said. Um, I do think that there are some like also data points and trends that you can kind of observe. I can definitely say that this is me speaking from my experience, but also I've heard a lot of other people say similar things. Um, your employer, honestly, something that could really affect how to communicate, like whether you should use vulnerability or not, um, could be that like their generation, because there's a lot of different generational attitudes towards work. And I know for sure that it seems like if your employer, if your supervisor or HR person is older, a baby boomer type person, they have a tendency to like really focus on just do your damn job. Like that's kind of a mentality that is frequently there. Whereas if you have like a younger supervisor or HR person, not necessarily even like, it doesn't have to be someone who's like in their 20s or something, but a lot of the time, I think that they're more likely to respond to a certain level of vulnerability because a lot of us have grown up in um, a environment where I think a lot of our peers have understood vulnerability more. Um, so that's what that's something I would say. And I don't, that may not be a popular thing, but I think that that's kind of a decent thing to consider is like, what is this person's philosophy towards work likely to be based on kind of the environment they grew up in. And there's a lot of information about that kind of thing.
Thank you. The next question relates to burnout. So, for folks who started a job and were not in a period of burnout, and now they find themselves in burnout, how do you navigate conversations with employers who may not understand why support is needed now? Arden and then Marianne?
Um, yeah, I don't, I guess I personally would just be like, if I had already disclosed something to them, um, and they knew a certain amount of information, then I would be honest and just say, I just found this out about myself. I realized that I need support in ways that I didn't know were available before. Like, it's not really your responsibility to justify or help them understand. Um, I also, I had another thought and it's like left my brain. Um, I think like, you can like kind of like what Tara was saying, like you can ask for things without specifically stating the disability. So you don't have to be like, I just found out I was autistic. You can just be like, I have a medical condition that is requiring these accommodations. And then, like your doctor can be more specific of what they need. But yeah, I don't think you necessarily have to give them like your late diagnosed story if you don't want to.
Yeah, I love this question because this is exactly what happened to me. And I don't know that I have like the most clear-cut answers because I'm still asking myself these types of questions all the time. I think one thing that helped me was explaining as a part of my like self-advocacy the concept of autistic burnout, which is something that I personally have been reading and learning a lot about. And it's not to say that like any type, like no neurotype earns burnout. Many kinds of people can become burned out, and all burnout is significant and something that should be addressed. But I was on like autistic burnout TikTok, and I remember I started seeing these videos that really freaked me out about like loss of cognitive function over time with people who are in burnout for a long time. And that's the sort of like the final straw that really motivated me to request accommodations. Is I was like, I'm not just burnt out and stressed and like unable to function at home right now. Like this is going to continue to be a problem and could have long lasting impacts on my health. So I threw in a little bit of education about that with the forms that I was filling out and just the language I was using to request accommodations. And yeah, I think that's helpful to not just like say that you're burnt out, but kind of give examples of the impact that it has on you and your functioning in the workplace and outside of it.
Thank y'all. One person asked, who has multiple disabilities, how can we navigate employment with autism, but also other disabilities, such as being deaf or hard of hearing? Jeremiah?
So it's certainly complicated, but basically, uh, employers should treat each disability as its own disability. So if you have co-occurring things, um, asking for an accommodation for one doesn't negate needing an accommodation for the other one. So it's still, you can ask for any accommodation that would help you do the work that you are being hired to do. And I mean, I could see situations where I mean, we do have a lot of folks that need help with getting interpreters or those sorts of things for work meetings and that type of stuff. It really is the same sort of process. It just makes it doubly more complicated and doubly more work to try and get those accommodations and explain to employers. But you basically would treat each one as its own separate thing and uh, move forward with that. And if the employers can figure out a way to like do an accommodation that can address multiple disabilities at one time, that's completely okay. They're free to do that. But they just need to be made aware of it, and each one can be addressed with its own accommodation if necessary.
Yes. What should employees do if their accommodation request is denied?
I can just tell you what I have done. I think I'm privileged to be in uh, I have my employer is large. There's not just HR for my department, but there's HR like for the whole thing, like above my HR. And then also I'm privileged that I am in a union. So I have union resources available and people who can help me advocate for myself. Um, so I think this question on here is like, should you ask again or escalate? I think you can ask again because like it's an interactive process, and if they say no to something, then you can, come up with other ideas and ask for those. And um yeah, I think you can escalate it for sure if it's denied. That's what I would personally do is just go to like the person above, like central HR, or if you work for the government, you can even go to your council person.
Um, I would say that like if they deny it, you could probably also um gain some information as to like how they deny it, because if it's something that seems to be like, you know, if it's not a if there's something they like actively talk to you about, like there's already a conversation started there. So they aren't necessarily going to they may not be denying the concept of you having accommodations, but they may be saying that this particular thing that has been specified just won't, we don't think it'll work in our workplace. And no, I'm not. Um, and where was it? Yeah, and so it's very much, I think, depending on how the process has been going, to say, you know, what do you think could help? Like, what do you, if it's a conversation that you're having, and that's assuming your employer is, has been somewhat receptive. Um, I don't think most people want people to fail. So,
Yes, Jeremiah and then Marianne. And one question, follow-up question I had is, I wonder if sometimes employers don't even know that you're formally requesting accommodations. And do you have to like need to make that clear if they don't realize that you're actually formally requesting accommodations, that rather than just asking for support in a way that they can just decide to deny because it's not a formal accommodation?
So to answer that quick question or the follow-up one, um, since you don't have to be really specific with your request, like it doesn't have to be a big formality. It might just be fine to just tell them or say, "Hey, did you have a chance to look into whether that's available or not?" But you can definitely say that this would, I would consider this an accommodation. It doesn't have to be a lot of, like I said before, legalese or real formal. They just need to make sure you just need to make sure that you made it clear that you are asking for something based on that disability. And so, but as far as when an employer denies an accommodation, there's a few things you can do and a few things they can do also. I think it's important to know that there are instances where it's completely legal for an employer to deny that accommodation. One of them is if they do not believe you have a disability. Like if they ask for more documentation and like there's actually, if you didn't provide much of anything to them and you said, hey, I have this problem, um, they can ask for more information if they request it. Yes, I am an attorney. Not any of your attorneys, though. This is not legal advice as far as particular to you, just kind of information out there so you guys, you all know what is applicable to these instances. And so, in an employer, it can become too prime to as far as like they can ask you for more information about how this affects your work, and you can also they can ask you if they deny an accommodation, it might be like Tara said that they might not have that specific accommodation itself, but then you can ask your employer about this is the specific issue that I'm facing, and I thought that this accommodation would address that issue, but maybe it just needs to be a different accommodation to address that same issue. That's very common too. But there's also something called an undue hardship. So if an employer determines that your accommodation would present an undue hardship, they can deny that accommodation. Now, an undue hardship can be financial, like say it would be costing the employer a whole lot of money to create your accommodation. And these things all are case by case basis. Like a company like Google would be able to have a lot more money to accommodate folks than say a mom and pop shop somewhere. And if it gets to that point, the judges that look at these cases would, look at all that stuff. And also, they can't totally change the business or fundamentally change what they're doing. Like, for instance, I think a good example is in the university setting in higher education. You can ask for a reasonable accommodation to give if you are someone who has dyscalculia and you're not good with math and you need more time to take the test and those sorts of things. You can absolutely ask for reasonable accommodations. You can't ask the school to just completely withdraw the math requirement entirely. You can ask for substitutions and those sorts of things, but there are limits that you can't just say, this is what I need to be successful with this. If you can't actually be successful with the thing, basically it's you should be able to do the job with the accommodation, if that makes sense. But then as far as if you are denied, even after going back with your boss and your employer, two things you do need. Well, actually, it's only one thing in Tennessee. So Tennessee has the Human Rights Commission, which is the state-based organization, and there's also the EEOC, that's the federal organization that's in charge with enforcing anti-discrimination laws like the ADA. And luckily in Tennessee, if you have a complaint with one, you have a complaint with the other. You don't need to file two because they have a work share agreement. But it is important to make that complaint as soon as you've exhausted all your resources and you are no longer getting any traction with your employer. And that's because there's a 180-day deadline for the sorts of complaints that you have to file with the EEOC or the Rights Commission. And at the same time, you also have to make that complaint in order to have a lawsuit against the employer based on that discrimination in the future. It's kind of the box you have to check in order to get to that, if it does get to that point. Want to make sure this is all worst case scenario, but you should know that there are instances where they can deny you. I believe earlier, I think it was Arden said that it only applies to organizations that have 15 or more employees, and that is correct. And also, I think it's the most important to remember who you're working with and who your boss is, and approaching it with we're all people. And like Tara said, most people want you to see you succeed. Your boss is not usually going to be a real jerk and just deny everything, but those people are out there, unfortunately. And if you can't get what you want by playing nice and trying to checking the boxes you need to, and it gets to that point, then yes, you do have recourse. And it's also illegal to retaliate against someone for making an accommodation. I think I saw some comments asking about that I'm afraid to ask for an accommodation. Retaliation because for asking an accommodation is completely illegal, and that shouldn't bar you from or make you afraid to ask for what you need to be successful.
Earlier, someone brought up having a paper trail, and I was just going to bring that up again in response to this question. I noticed through my process of requesting accommodations, I did have a big interactive process, a lot of back and forth. The HR people kind of counter offered on a couple of my accommodations. And I noticed the HR really preferred to speak over the phone, which I think was because they did not want a paper trail for some of those conversations that I was having. But I knew I wanted that so that if I did need to escalate or do some sort of follow-up afterwards, I would have it in writing. Also, part of my accommodations are having more things in writing. So what I would do is after each phone conversation, I would write down a summary and send it to them. And that way, if they objected to anything I wrote down, we could debate what we talked about. But that way I had a record and they had a record that I had that record. So that's something I would recommend in case you need to file a complaint or do some other sort of follow-up after the process.
All right. It's fast. That's literally what I was about to say, basically, as well. And I think that honestly, email is like a really great way for that. Like, I would also do no part of this process without having every single thing I possibly could in an email that all parties were able to see. Um, and I think that like even something that people don't think about is emails have timestamps, which are verifiable multiple places and servers. So a lot of the job I did was literally when people were like, "There's something wrong here." I'd go through like dozens and dozens of dates and put together a chronology for it. And a lot of times the answer would be, "Oh, actually, you did something wrong." So, or you incorrectly, you know, processed XYZ thing. Um, and so having the ability to draw a definitive chronology in the communication is also just a thing that's extremely useful. And so you can, write things, but if they're not verifiable in some way, they don't exist, kind of. Like if it's not written down, it never happened. I think a lot of social workers can tell you that kind of mentality from writing a note to document an encounter is that if you're in court, if you didn't write it down, it never happened. So it doesn't protect you or the person. But same goes for anything. There needs to be people need to have seen it, and everyone needs to be able to not deny they got it.
And another question related to legal rights. I don't know if you have anything else to add for folks who have lost jobs due to unmet accommodations. Are there any additional protections or steps folks should consider if they have lost a job?
So it will be the same process. If you've termination or just discrimination by having a accommodation denied is treated the same way as far as your legal recourse. So be the same process about filing a complaint with the EEOC. I did forget to mention if you work for a federal employer, then it's the EEO, not the EEOC, or it's the EEC. It's a different one. I'll find it and put it in the chat for y'all, but it's the same process. The act might be different, but it's still discrimination in that sense if that's the process you would go through.
Thank you. And we have a couple of specific work setting questions that came through when folks were signing up for the event. One of them is for folks who work in high stress fields like healthcare or education. What accommodations are realistic and how can you advocate for them?
So I liked this question because the two fields I have worked in are healthcare and education. My experience requesting accommodations is in healthcare, and I have heard, like, I've seen people in the chat saying, I'm worried, like, I work in healthcare, I don't think I'm going to get any. Like, it definitely can be difficult if you, especially if you work in like direct clinical care where things are very like rigid and structured in certain ways. One strategy that was helpful for me, which I kind of wish I didn't have to do, but this is how our world works, is that in addition to explaining why the accommodations would be helpful for me, I also explained how they would be helpful to the patients and families that we served. So the probably like most controversial accommodations that I requested is a change in schedule. So pretty much everyone on my team worked Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. I covered an inpatient unit, which meant there were kids on there 24/7. There were stressful procedures and new admissions and things happening around the clock. And so I created an SBAR, which is like a business school. It's like situation, background, assessment, recommendations, to write about how many unmet needs were happening between the hours of like 7:30 to 8 and 4:30 to 6, because I was requesting to move to 4 10-hour days. So I would be providing coverage during those times of day. I started collecting data on the number of like pages and consults we were getting during those hours where we didn't have coverage, and did things like, counting the number of new admissions that came in later in the day, to show that I was going to be able to add to what we could provide to our patients and families, and that there would be a benefit for my colleagues and my supervisors who were working to better support our patient population. So that ended up, it was really interesting because at the time, a lot of us were advocating for different schedules for similar reasons to what I just described. And it eventually did happen. But once I got my accommodations, I was able to collect even more data, and they were able to say like, hey, this person is working 4 10s. She's able to like do these extra things during those before and after hours. And I think ultimately that helped some of my other colleagues get that flexibility without having to go through the formal accommodation process.
Also, healthcare and higher ed have been pretty much my entire career of work. But I can say that having been a manager with folks who like were struggling with things that, were accommodation worthy, even though I couldn't be like, hey, you should just ask for this. They would, that would be a serious risk to my job if it got found out. But like I I want people to succeed. Like I like working with people who are, not grumpy all the time and who are doing well and also just like happy. I mean, 'cause I like that. But um kind of how Mary said, um show how it's a benefit to, in that case, um the person who is receiving services, show how it's a benefit to the people who you are in any way like working with. So it could also even literally be like, we can make more money if we do this. If they're, a for-profit business and collecting data is great. But the one thing I was going to say from like a standpoint of having managed folks is I'm super stressed out as well because like the odds are like there's 3 or 4 layers of bureaucracy above me and like hierarchy, and the person 3 layers up sees an issue and they're going to be like, Kara, why aren't you doing anything about this? Like, why is your team? And so like I'm stressed and my supervisor's probably stressed too. And um, so like I want I I want people to be like, hey, here's the issue. And I'm like, please can we help you with this so that we can actually I don't want to get yelled at either. And I definitely don't want to be told I have to like, write you up or something because like I just don't like conflict in general. So um yeah.
Thank you. There's another question related to like this could be more like accommodations with potential clients if you, okay, I'll just read it. How can freelancers or self-employed individuals or volunteers navigate accommodations when there's no formal HR process?
Um, I did this before asking for official accommodations. So while I don't have specific experience in those settings, um, I think what I did is just like you can frame it like, hey, I discovered I really work better when blank. Is it okay if I do that moving forward? Um, you can say like I need blank to do my job. Like, um, I think you can also say like uh you can disclose however much you feel comfortable disclosing to a client or like if you're a volunteer, like wherever you work at. Um, but yeah, I don't feel like it's like necessary to be like, I'm requesting accommodations for my disability. Like you can do it kind of casually like that. Um, but you always can be more direct if you want to.
Um, so specifically to the volunteering item is I in the event that, someone is not receptive to talking to you, volunteering uh things, I've just left if they haven't been like receptive to working with me. Um and like I have I can care about the work and that, but there's also some other way I can do that kind of work. That's what I'm doing like now is now in my off time I do a lot of the same areas of work that I did um, when I was like formally employed doing social work, but in a way that I think is a lot better, honestly, and more ethical. Um, so like you can, but if you're just volunteering and you don't feel like something's right, I don't think you should force yourself into that. And I think a lot of people think I've made a commitment, but I think also like a lot of social workers who continue to work during after they become burnt out in like a professional sense, which is a big thing, are also actively harming the people they're trying to help by not, yeah, I think that you are no longer really able to be what you want to be and do what you want to do in those circumstances. So in volunteering and that kind of thing, I say part ways because you don't deserve to suffer from that.
Thank you. And last question, well, yes, last question before we open it up for Q&A. What is, okay, you've given a lot of suggestions already, but is there any one other piece of advice that you haven't given already that you would give to an autistic employee or job seeker trying to navigate accommodation successfully? It's like a very broad question in case there's anything that is on your mind that hasn't been brought up yet. Jeremiah and then Marianne and then Tara.
Just know that you're not alone. I mean, there's resources like besides, and I meant to say this earlier, but if you find yourself in a situation where you don't get an accommodation, um, even filing an EEOC complaint, Disability Rights Tennessee can help you with that. There's also lots of legal aid associations in Tennessee. There's surely one in your part of the state. And you can reach out to us. We can hook you up with those referrals for and attorneys that are either free or low cost that can help with those sorts of things. And also, there's also something called vocational rehabilitation, especially for folks that might be joining the workforce for the first time or haven't for a long time. And reasonable, and they can help you finding a job, but also make sure that the job fits with you and it has accommodations so you can be successful. Is the entire point of this. And also, I forgot to mention too, if a place determines that your accommodation is an undue hardship, they have to, based on financial reasons, they have to make sure that they have applied for assistance through somewhere like vocational rehabilitation or tax credits or those sorts of things. So they basically just can't say that we don't have the funds for that, because there are public funds available for these sorts of things, and they can't just deny you for that. But it's one of those situations where if you don't know about these other organizations like DRT or legal aid that can help you navigate that process, it can seem scary and daunting. So just know that you're not alone, and you can reach out not only to professional organizations, but to each other in these sorts of things.
I was just going to say that one positive to me of navigating the accommodations process, it was stressful, but I found that I was open about it with select coworkers who I trusted, and I found that just spurred a lot of conversations and got other people to be more open and just talk about disability, which to me it felt really positive, just in terms of building a more inclusive workplace culture. I had someone come to me and say, I think I'm autistic and I'm going through that process of trying to figure out if I'm going to get a diagnosis or where do I go from there. Someone who was like, I have ADHD, I have so much shame about it, but I've been thinking about accommodations for my executive dysfunction and blah, blah, blah. And then someone else who was like, oh my gosh, I have this invisible illness. And it did help me feel more connected to be a little bit visible, and just start to find other people who were going through similar things without talking about them. So that's not necessarily my advice that you need to be open about that, because every workplace is different and you need to do what makes you feel safe. But I would just echo, you're not alone. And if you are in a place where you feel safe and comfortable to be a little bit more open about what's happening, that can be a really powerful tool for building connection.
I was kind of going to say both of the two things that were just said, but also, yeah, you probably have people who care about you in the workplace, like maybe coworkers, and they're not necessarily unsafe to talk to, and they also, especially if you struggle reading things, may have a better read on your supervisor, or and so if you trust that with them, having friends can just be supportive and help. And even if you decide not to go through it, building better relationships with people in the workplace usually makes your workplace better. As to the voc rehab thing, there are a lot of, I know that there are different voc rehab models as well. There are, but a lot of voc rehab programs also can help folks get basic supplies that they need for their job. If you need non-slip boots, hard hat, I don't know, a broom. None of those are good examples of things necessarily, but they they can often support you in ways that are beyond finding a job and talking to an employer. So it's not a bad idea. I don't think every voc rehab program is made equal, but yeah.
It was Benjamin's message in the chat that made me think of this, but I think just it's sad, but you probably will encounter ableism. You probably will feel dehumanized in some way throughout the process, because it is hard work to advocate for yourself. I think a lot of people don't have experience doing that. So I guess I would just try to rely on a support system, and don't take anything personally, because however you're treated is not about you. I think it's about their own biases and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you all. I'm going to start going through some of the questions that came in the chat. And the first one I was going to ask is, can't remember if we've addressed this one already, is how do we go about asking for accommodations if there's not a human resources department? Oh, y'all did answer that one. Sorry, you did answer that one. Okay. Uh, the next one is they were saying they are a high masking autistic person. So how do you know what accommodations you need if you just like don't know, if you can't tell what? So let me just read it. I'm a high masking. How can you tell what you need if you can't tell? I'm not sure if they're asking if you can't tell your boss or if they can't tell what they need.
We brought up that website Ask Jan earlier. I would definitely go on there. They really have like such a comprehensive list of different accommodations. I spent a lot of time on there and they had ideas that like I never would have thought of, but that once I read them and really thought about them, I was like, oh yeah, like I think that would help me. Or some of them were things I could try out for a couple days. Like there were different ideas for sensory accommodations, and I'm high masking and like often do like not consider my own sensory needs. So even just reading a bunch of examples of what has helped other people helped me to think more through my options. And then I think also remembering that it doesn't have to be like this life or death like need for you to request an accommodation. Like anything that makes it more easy and accessible for you to perform your job function and like overcome challenges related to your disability is something you can request. It doesn't have to be like, oh my God, like the light in my office is so bright, it's like burning my eyeballs out and I can't think and I like whatever, to be something that you want to address. So I think those of us who are high masking sometimes have learned to like deny our needs so much that it feels like we can only request support if there's like 10 million alarm bells going off and it's like an absolute medical emergency. So taking some time to think through that, those would be my two recommendations.
Um, I also think, yeah, that I don't know if this was again the question that was being asked is if your employer can't tell or if you can't tell. But for the if you can't tell, like again, Ask Jan is great. Like it basically walks you it will walk you through figuring out a lot of like what the questions you're even asking are just because of how it's laid out. It's very well structured. Um, and as to if you don't think your employer can tell, I suspect they know something. People are fairly intuitive and they may not. Uh, I have, yeah, folks, they know. Like, they know that you're probably struggling with something. And just because they don't understand why, because it's something being masked, doesn't mean they're not receptive to hearing about, like, what they already know, even if they just don't have a way to describe it or put it into words. People also just like understanding things. So if they do know, which again, they probably know that something's hard for you. Um, they probably would are just curious why and would be interested in like how they can help. Like a lot of the times, I think that people, especially if it's a supervisor you work closely with, assume that they won't want to be helpful. Um, but I I don't think people generally are like that. And I think that especially if your supervisor is stressed, helping you help them be less stressed is also like a great thing. Everybody wins. Nobody loses whatsoever. Um, and win-win situations are win-win. They're great.
Thank you. We had a question come in earlier. Um, let's see. Someone said that their son got a job and the son was reading the employee handbook, and there was a policy that was listed in the handbook that employees should report to their supervisor if medications need to be used for ADHD. And that was like in the policy handbook. So their son, who is like very by the book, followed up and told them that they use ADHD medications. And afterward, the whole environment changed, the communication changed. They started treating him differently. And after he revealed that he used ADHD medication, and it frustrated him to the point of quitting. So I just wanted to ask, like, any thoughts about that, Jeremiah? Is that even legal to like ask people?
Yeah, no. You don't have to disclose what medication you're on ever to any employer. And the fact that you even asked that, I guess, would just tip me off. That's not the type of place that I would want to work at. So maybe that was a blessing in disguise, but absolutely, if an employer asks you to disclose what medications you're on, especially if you need to take them while at work, yeah, you never have to disclose that information.
Thank you. And one person asked just how to be a good support person to their autistic loved one who is in the process of trying to find a job.
Wait, Mary, were you gonna talk? You can.
Sorry, I just forgot to raise my hand. You can go first.
I also didn't raise my hand. Um, I've like lost my train of thought, so I cannot speak right now.
How about Tara, then Marianne, and then Arden, if Arden is ready to talk then?
Um, so supporting someone, uh, I think that it's not a bad place to start to just remember that job searches are really hard for everyone and like really hard. And they're even more brutal like now than they have been in the past a lot of the time. And so, you know, if you think, if you have a partner who is, you know, very different neurotype than like what you're experiencing, like they also do not like job searches. Like people will not leave a job that's bad because they don't want to do a job search. It can be that bad. And so be like, hey, what you experience, but also like I have to put 50% of my energy towards making sure I do the things, not just doing the things. Like, being able to organize and that, or, when I am done with an interview, whether it went well or bad, like I'm probably just gonna crash. Like my partner knows that I'm really likely to get depressed when I get home after a fun social outing, just because my energy's gone. And it's not a problem. It's just usually I nap it off. But it's hard for everyone. You can appeal to people's what they know as well.
Yeah, I have specific parts of the job application process that are really, really stressful for me, or not even just job applications, but job hunting. So things like networking, I know that it's super helpful to reach out to people that you maybe like have a mutual connection with and do informational interviews and learn about opportunities. But like, wow, that gives me so much anxiety. I also hate asking someone for references. Like it just like I'll procrastinate on it for days, weeks, months. And so when people offer support to me when I'm in that time, I will have them like draft emails for me, look over like scripts that I'm planning for an informational interview or a phone call. I have previously been so anxious about a reference request that I will like send an email to someone. I'll draft an email to someone, get a friend to review it, get a friend to click send, and give a friend my email password so they can check my email to see if the person responded and said yes or no. And those are just some ways I've been accommodating myself through the process. So yeah, I think asking for like if you can identify specific parts of the process that bring up extra anxiety for that person, and be like an encourager or an editor, that can be really helpful.
I would actually like also, I think, piggyback on that a bit and expound is like, I know I've talked about a lot like how people want to help you, but a lot of times, like there are people who I've been like, I hope they ask me to be one of their references one day because I adore this person and I want to say some great stuff about them. Um, and so again, like it's a good chance people are going to be like, I would love to help you, you know, sometime in the future, even if we're not in contact much. And I have kind of, I don't know if solved is my right word for references, but I basically have people who have said, blanket, I'll be your reference if you want. Just let me know what you're applying for and where you put me down. And so it standing, agreement, like they could of course tell me they can't do that anymore, and I would respect that. But um, yeah, and also one thing that I hate doing is like filling out background check information, which I know is like generally a kind of pre-hire process thing, but trying to remember all the addresses and stuff that I've lived at is awful. And so like that kind of thing, I just have a document with all of that ready to go so that I can just copy and paste it in when I have that, because otherwise I'm going to spend like 3 hours filling out my background check information trying to hunt down the addresses I lived at on Google Maps or something. So yeah, I think a lot of having things in place that are just standard for job searches is helpful. And cover letters are a whole other thing if you have to do cover letters. But also that kind of applies there too. Yeah, so I think basically it sounded like you're asking that should if your manager kind of sees that something's difficult, should they know what you need? Um, and I think absolutely not. You can't expect people to really understand that necessarily. And I also think that because a lot of people interpret things differently, if they think they know something, like there's a very good chance they may interpret it how they would interpret it and do something that's the exact opposite fix. Like people don't have universal fixes for, you know, stimulus. Maybe like they if they happen to realize that it's too bright, um, they could be like, oh, there's like just think to themselves, they can have them do something in a area that's not as, bright, but maybe, I don't know, there's a horrible sound there or something. And like, which is also, they need the information to be able to help because otherwise they can't make informed choices to help.
Thank you. Well, we are at 8:02, everyone, and oh yes, Jeremiah, looks like Arden has one more question for you. Would it be okay if they send you an email?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. So thank you all very much to the panelists and to everyone who is here who shared your comments and your experiences and your questions. Very grateful for this past hour and a half with all of you. And um, I guess that's all I have to say, but sorry, after about an hour and a half of like facilitating, I start losing my words and thoughts don't come out as easily, but thank you all very much. That is all I have to say, I think.